Alright, today I'm going to walk you through my complete workflow for achieving cinematic results with the iPhone 16 Pro Max, including gear, camera settings, my Apple log exposure method, and color grading. I've been polishing this workflow for the last couple of months while experimenting with my iPhone, and I can promise you that after watching this video, you'll achieve much better results with your iPhone 16 Pro or Pro Max. With that said, let's start with the gear. So first of all, to provide extra protection for my iPhone while keeping a minimalist setup and having the option to mount accessories like camera lenses and filters, I use either the Freewheel Sherpa case or the Sandmark Pro case. Generally, the Freewheel Sherpa case has better build quality. It also allows you to mount Freewheel iPhone filters magnetically, but it's slightly thicker and heavier than the Sandmark Pro case. However, one thing to consider if you buy the Freewheel Sherpa case is to make sure you get the new version with the 70mm mount, not the old proprietary Freewheel mounting option, as the new mount is much more versatile, allowing you to basically use any lens or filter with a 17mm mount, whereas with the proprietary Freewheel option, you can only use proprietary Freewheel filters and lenses. Moving on days when I plan to shoot a lot with the iPhone and want to make the experience as comfortable as possible, or when I need to mount multiple accessories, I use the Freewheel Genius rig. This rig has a lot of cool features, including a full metal build, detachable side handles for quickly switching between horizontal and vertical shooting modes, multiple cold shoe mounts and 1/4-inch threads for attaching additional accessories, a mini detachable magnetic remote control for remotely starting and stopping recording, support for Freewheel magnetic iPhone filters, compatibility with camera lenses using either a 17mm thread mount or the proprietary Freewheel mount, and a detachable mini tabletop tripod or selfie stick with 1/4-inch threads. Now I know this thing is pretty expensive, it's $150 to be precise, but I think it's worth the price if you care about the fancy features and the fantastic build quality. But if all you care about is just having a more comfortable grip when shooting with your iPhone, you can get something similar to this for about $30 to $50 on AliExpress or Amazon. I'm going to leave some links down below. But regardless, I still highly recommend getting something like this if you are serious about shooting with your iPhone, because in my opinion, it's much more comfortable to grip the iPhone like this for long periods of time than just having it inside a case and doing this. Also, at least for me, psychologically, when I have the iPhone inside a rig like this, it's much less distracting because I'm not going to have the phone in here and scroll through social media or do phone calls and stuff like that. I'm only going to use my phone as a camera, which makes the experience of using the iPhone as a camera much more fun, in my personal opinion at least. Anyway, moving on to filters, I typically use either the Freewheel 1 to 5 stop magnetic VND or the Sandmark 3 to 6 stop 43mm threaded VND to maintain natural motion blur in my shots. However, I mostly gravitate towards the Sandmark VND because it's more versatile with its threaded mount, especially if you have the step down ring to 17mm, which allows you to use it on any case or cage with a 70mm thread mount, whereas with the Freewheel VND filter you have to use proprietary Freewheel accessories to use it. But if you don't want to buy special iPhone filters and you have a mirrorless camera with some spare VND filters like this one actually from KNF Concept, you can just buy a step down ring to 70mm and use it on any cage or case with a 70mm thread mount. Now, as a bonus, if you have the DJI Pocket 3 and some filters for the DJI Pocket 3 as well, and you have the Freewheel Sherpa case with the old Freewheel magnetic mounting system, you can actually use the filters from the Pocket 3 with this case because both of these are magnetic. Let me see, where's my filter? So here I have the small rig 2 to 5 stop magnetic VND, and this is the Freewheel Sherpa case, and I can just mount it magnetically here. It fits exactly the 24mm lens and also the 13mm lens. The filter size is just enough, so if you have some spare filters from the Pocket 3 or if you want to keep your setup as compact as possible and you don't want to carry something like this with a big filter, then using this magnetic case with pocketry filters is definitely the most compact way to do it. All right, next, sometimes I use camera lenses for the iPhone. For now, I mainly use the Sandmark 16mm wide lens, the 58mm telephoto lens, and the Freewell anamorphic 1.33x lens. All of these lenses produce sharp, beautiful image quality with a minimal amount of artifacts. I've made a whole video about the Sandmark lenses. If you want to watch that video, I'm going to leave it up here. And finally, to record high quality ambient audio, I use the Rode Video Micro 2 shotgun microphone with the Boya BYK4 USB-C to 3.5mm adapter, so I can easily connect the microphone to the iPhone. Now, I know this is a very niche thing, but I highly recommend using an external microphone with any camera for that matter when taking your shots, because the audio from that location, the ambient audio from where you're shooting with your camera, is going to add another layer to your production value and basically enhance the visuals, make the visuals much better, at least in my opinion. Moving on to camera settings, I use the Blackmagic camera app to record all my footage on the iPhone. It's free and gives me all the control I need to achieve great results when shooting with Apolog. So first of all, let's go to the settings menu in here. For the codec, I'm using Apple ProRes Photo 2 LT, and the reason for that is because I find it to give a perfect balance between storage and image quality. However, if you want to achieve the absolute best results on the iPhone, you should use Apple ProRes Photo 2 HQ. And if you want to save as much space as possible on the iPhone, you should use HEVC. But I find that HEVC produces significantly more artifacts than ProRes Photo 2 LT, which is why I use ProRes Photo 2 LT. All right, next, for the resolution, I'm using 4K. For the color space, I'm using Apolog HDR to give myself the most flexibility when it comes to color grading in post-production. Then the rest, I don't really touch. For the camera settings in here, I don't really do anything except for when I'm using anamorphic lenses, in which case I'll go to anamorphic D-squeeze and select the D-squeeze that I need depending on the lens that I'm using. Next, for audio, I don't really do anything in here. However, if I go to the camera settings in here and click the audio meters in here, sometimes I adjust the audio gain if necessary. I usually leave it at about 70% with my microphone, but it's going to depend on the microphone you're going to use. For the monitor settings in here, I have focus assist set to colored lines. Then I have the assist color set to red, and then I have the guides set to 100% white and 50%, so I can properly compose and frame my shots. The rest in here I don't really touch. Let's go to media. In here at the moment, I have save clips to set to files because I'm going to record later on to my SSD, but usually I record everything internally and I set it to in-app only and then just airdrop the files to my MacBook. For the LUTs in here, I enable display LUT just so I won't see this gray looking image, but I'm not baking in the LUT to the footage because I want to have that flexibility when color grading in DaVinci Resolve. And I'm using the default LUT that's built into Blackmagic camera app. I'm not using any special app or something like that. Now for the rest in here, I don't really do anything. I just have everything here set to default. All right, let's go to the camera menu in here. And first, I'm using the 24mm lens pretty much for like 95% of the time because it produces the best image quality on the iPhone. And when I need to change the focal length, I would use my Sandmark lenses, or if I want to have a unique look, I would use my Freewell anamorphic lens. I never use the 13mm lens or the 48mm lens because they produce significantly worse image quality than using an optical lens. However, sometimes I do use the 120mm lens because I couldn't find a good telephoto optical lens. So sometimes when I need a telephoto shot, I would use the 120mm. But for like 95% of the time, I'm using the 24mm because it produces the best results on the iPhone. Next, for the frame rate, I'm using 25 frames per second. However, if I'm gonna do slow motion, I'll set it to 50 or even 100p. Next, for the shutter, it's locked all the time at 1/50, and I basically adjust the exposure with my ND filter in here. For the ISO, I always shoot at ISO 54 because I find it to produce the cleanest image quality on the iPhone 16 Pro Max. However, it does produce a very narrow dynamic range. If you want to achieve a wider dynamic range, the widest dynamic range possible on the iPhone 16 Pro Max, you should use ISO 1600. But you'll guarantee have to apply noise reduction in post-production because the image is going to become very noisy and soft. And also, you'll have to use a very strong ND filter to compensate for the exposure. So I'm just leaving the ISO at 54, and sometimes if I need to bump up the exposure, I'll go not higher than 200. In my personal opinion, from 54 ISO to 200 is where the iPhone performs the best. But of course, if you want to achieve the absolute best results, keep the ISO as low as possible. And if you want to achieve the widest dynamic range possible, use ISO 1600, but the image is going to become significantly noisier, softer, and also you'll have to use a more strong ND filter. As for the white balance, I always use manual white balance. I basically unlock it and then move this Kelvin scale value in here, and I judge the white balance by just looking at the display. If it looks right on the display, then I know it's right because I find the display on the iPhone to be very color accurate. However, you can also use the presets in here, which work fine as well, but I'm just gonna use it manually here. Now for the tint, I always leave it at about 10 to 12. I find it to be very neutral, which is what I want for color grading and post-production. I'm just gonna lock it in here and move on to these settings in here. First of all, zebras, I always have enabled and they set to 80%. And the reason they set to 80% is because the clipping point for ISO 54 is 80%, which is why you have narrower dynamic range at ISO 54. So let me show you an example. If I'm going to open up my ND filter here, you'll see the zebras showing up. But if I'm going to switch to 85% zebras, you'll see that the zebras disappear, meaning that at ISO 54, the iPhone cannot capture higher than 80 IRE or 80% zebras. Whereas, I'm gonna switch to ISO 1600, go to my zebra settings, I can go higher, 85% zebras still visible, 90% zebras are still visible, and even at 95% the zebras are still visible, but at 100% they disappear. So basically the clipping point for ISO 1600 is 95%, and the clipping point for ISO 54 is 80%, which is why you get a wider dynamic range at ISO 1600. That's why I'm saying that if you want to achieve the widest dynamic range on the iPhone, you should film at ISO 1600. Next, for the peaking, I turn it on and off all the time depending on how I want to focus. If I use autofocus, I generally turn it off, but for the most part I use manual focus. I would leave it on just to make sure that I'm focused correctly. Next, for the grids, I use that just to help myself when composing my shots. Aspect ratio, I'm using 2:1 aspect ratio, and that's because I film all of my YouTube videos in a 2:1 aspect ratio, but you don't have to use this. You can just turn it off if you're shooting at 16:9 aspect ratio. This thing I don't really touch. False colors, I do use when exposing for skin, and I'll show you later on exactly how. And finally, for the display LUT, I do enable it just to make it easier for myself when previewing my footage, just so I know how it will look, roughly at least, on my computer. All right, moving on to focus. Sometimes I use autofocus like this if I want to do everything automatically. However, if I want to have more control, I sometimes disable this and then adjust the focus manually with focus peaking to help myself see if I'm focused correctly or not. But you can also set it to auto and then just tap and hold on the screen where you want to lock the focus, and it's going to basically lock the focus for you. As you can see now, it's not auto-focusing. All right, next for the EV compensation, I don't really touch this because I'm always exposing my shots manually. Stabilization, I use standard, and if I need more stabilization, I would apply it manually in DaVinci Resolve in post-production. This thing I sometimes use if I want to judge focus, and then this thing in here, I don't really use. All right, and now let me show you how I expose my iPhone footage properly to get the absolute best results when shooting in Apple Log. I'm going to start with a simple landscape scene and then move on to something a bit more contrasty and complex. So basically, you have three ways to judge exposure on the iPhone. The first one is by using the screen, and I find it to be very accurate when it comes to judging exposure. Usually, if it looks good on the screen, it's going to look good as well when editing in post-production. The second way is by using zebras, and I use this to see if I have anything clipped in the shot. So for example, if I'm going to open up my ND filter,
you see zebras in here, and this means basically that this information is gone and I need to reduce the exposure if I want to preserve the highlights as much as possible. So let me reduce the intensity on the ND filter. And now basically I'm good to go. And the final way to judge exposure on the iPhone is by using the histogram. And I use this tool the least because it's not the best tool to use when it comes to judging exposure for video shooting, especially when you have a lot of camera movement in the shot. So let me show you how I would expose for something like this. First of all, I know that nothing is clipped in my highlights, but if I look at this shot on the screen, it looks a bit bright for my eyes. And also if I look at the histogram, I see this spike here on the right side, which means that I'm almost at the clipping point for the highlights. And usually I try to preserve the highlights as much as possible on the iPhone. So in this case, because my ND filter reached its limit, I'm just going to use my shutter just for this example to reduce the exposure. And I'm looking at the display also while glancing at the histogram, and I think something like this looks good for me. I'm gonna lock this and take the shot. Let me show you another example. First of all, I'm going to lower my shutter speed to 1/50, then open up my exposure, and now start closing it until it looks good on the display. I also glance at the histogram to see if I'm somewhat okay when it comes to exposure. And I think around here looks good to me. Also, I can go to my autofocus settings and just lock the focus to the background here by tapping and holding on the background. And now, take my shot. All right, now let me show you how I would expose for something a bit more complex, where you have a lot of contrast between shadows and highlights. First of all, let me disable the zebras and also disable the peaking. And I think I need to warm up the image a little bit because the white balance looks a bit off. So I'm gonna go to my white balance, unlock it, and then warm up the image slightly. I would say about 5500 looks good. Lock the white balance. And in a scene like this, you have to make some sacrifices. You cannot expose for everything. You either expose for the highlights or you expose for the shadows. In this case, because I don't have a clear subject in the scene, I would expose for the highlights. But if I had a subject right here where my hand is, I would definitely expose for the shadows because the subject in this case is going to be much more important than preserving the highlights. Regardless, let me show you how I would expose this for the highlights and then basically for my skin or for the shadows. So let me first of all lock the focus. Let's enable peaking in here. Go to autofocus, tap and hold on this tree in here. Wait for it to lock the focus. Then I'm going to enable the zebras. And I see that this part is clipped basically. And I'm going to reduce the exposure with the ND filter until I no longer see zebras, which is something around here. And now if I look at the screen, the image looks perfectly fine for me. So I'm just going to press record and get the shot. Now let me show you how I would expose this for the shadows basically. In this case, because I'm exposing for my skin, I would go here to my false colors, enable this, and I adjust the exposure until I see pink and slight gray on my hand. So in this case, I'll probably have to remove the ND filter, put my hand. This is a bit too bright. Let me lower the exposure here until I see pink like this on my hand. I would say something like this looks okay. A bit of pink and also gray on skin. If I'm going to disable the false colors and look at the display, first of all, the highlights are completely gone, but I don't really care about that because I'm exposing for the shadows for my hand. Let me turn off the zebras, and if I look on the screen, the exposure on my hand looks completely fine. If you see a little bit of pink on the skin and some gray, this is when, at least with my skin, it's good exposure for skin. So let me disable this and get the shot. All right, let me show you another example. First of all, let me put the shutter to 1/50. Then I'm gonna enable zebras, enable focus peaking, go to my focus settings, lock the focus to somewhere around here. Now I can disable the peaking. and start lowering the exposure with the ND filter until I no longer see zebras in the brightest part of the frame, which is somewhere around here. Maybe I can also adjust the white balance, make it a bit warmer, something like this, lock this. And now I look at the screen, it looks fine to me. Let's press record and get the shot. Now again, if I was exposing for my skin, first of all, let me enable autofocus. I would go to my false colors, and if I see pink and slight light gray on my skin, which is somewhere around here, I know I'm good. I can disable this, look at the screen to make sure everything is correct, and now I can just press record. Very easy. Now let me show you a final example because I feel like you get the idea. Here I'm exposing for like a simple landscape shot. As you can see, the highlights are overexposed. So let me adjust my ND filter until I no longer see zebras, which is about here. I reached my limit with the ND filter. So I'm gonna go to my shutter and reduce the exposure until the zebras are not visible, which is about here, but still it looks a bit too bright for me. And if I look at the histogram in here, I see a spike on the right side, which means it's almost the clipping point for the highlights. And again, I want to preserve the highlights as much as possible when shooting with the iPhone. So I'm gonna go again to my shutter speed and slightly reduce it to somewhere about here. Lock this, go to my focus setting, lock the focus to the background, maybe reduce the white balance in here, and now get my shot.
Alright, finally let me show you how I color grade my iPhone footage in DaVinci Resolve in a very simple and straightforward manner. So here I have 3 clips on the timeline that I shot with you guys today. This is clip number 1, this is clip number 2, and this is clip number 3. Let's start with this one. First of all, I have here a CST in and then a CST out. I'm going from Rec 2020 Apple Log to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate for the CST in, and then for the CST out, I'm going from DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate to Rec 709 Type A. And that's because I want to work in the widest color space possible inside DaVinci Resolve. However, if you are not using DaVinci Resolve, you can just download a simple Apple Log to Rec 709 LUT and use it on pretty much any editing software like Final Cut Pro, Premiere Pro, LumaFusion, and so on. Next, I have here a noise reduction node, which I didn't use because everything looks very clean in here, even if I pixel peep. However, if I shot this at ISO 1600, which produces a wider dynamic range than ISO 54, I would have to do a lot of noise reduction to remove the noise, especially from the shadows, which is again why I highly recommend shooting at ISO 54 if you want to produce the cleanest image quality on the iPhone 16 Pro Max. Next, I have here the exposure node where I slightly tweaked the exposure with the HDR global wheel in here. I basically increased the exposure by 0.45, and this is the before and after, before and after. Then I added some contrast with the contrast slider in here. This is the before and after, before and after. Then I tweaked the white balance with the primaries and the gain wheel. This is the before and after, before and after. And I mainly did this because of the slight tint my ND filter produces. Otherwise, I wouldn't have to do anything because I pretty much nailed the white balance in camera, which is again why I highly recommend to lock the white balance and use the iPhone's screen to see if the white balance looks correct or not. Then here I added some saturation using the color slice saturation slider in here. This is the before and after, before and after, and honestly that's pretty much it. If I want to, I can also enable my dehancer film emulation LUT just to add a film look and also some grain to the shot. This is how it looks like with the dehancer. As you can see, it basically adds a bit of grain, which makes the shot look a bit less digital and softer, and also it adds like a vibe, like a look to the shot. This is the before and after, before and after. Now let me show you how beautiful the skin tones are on the iPhone. So I'm gonna enable my CST in and then CST out. Then here I did a slight exposure adjustment, contrast adjustment, white balance adjustment, and then saturation adjustment. I'm gonna open my vector scope in here, use the qualifier, and as you can see, my skin is pretty much on point on the skin tone indicator line on the vector scope. And also if I look at my skin, just, you know, on the display, it looks amazing. It looks very accurate, which is why I love shooting with the iPhone, because the skin tones look fantastic, in my opinion at least. And I didn't have to do any skin adjustments, nothing. It's basically straight from the camera, without any LUTs, without any adjustments, just a slight tweak. I did a slight tweak with the balance in here to compensate for the tint from my ND filter, but that's basically it. Finally, let's see how this shot looks. I'm basically going to enable all of these nodes in here, and I used the same workflow as before: CST in, CST out, then exposure adjustment, contrast adjustment, then white balance adjustment, then saturation adjustment, and finally I also added the enhancer. Right, and I think this is pretty much it. I hope this video was not too boring, because honestly it was a bit boring for me to make, but regardless, I hope you found it informative and useful. And of course, if you have any specific questions about how to use the iPhone for getting the best results, let me know down below. And also, if you have some tips on how I can improve my iPhone footage, also leave that down below. And I guess I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.